myself and talk about the results of that study. And then we'll outline some of the conclusions and the sort of outstanding issues from the work. And hopefully that will then lead into an interesting discussion. So in terms of the aims of this study, it's really relevant at this point to say what the backdrop for this study is. And really it's about the new environmental land management scheme that is going to replace the policies for common agricultural policy in the UK. And it was really trying to find out, because this particular approach that the UK government are now taking is built around the idea of a more sustainable farming, which is about protecting natural assets and the benefits from it. And also it's about trying to incentivize farmers to protect those natural assets and basically pay public money for the provision of public goods. We wanted to find out what public benefits can be provided by Upland Hill Farm specifically under the new environmental land management scheme. And we also wanted to find out if implementing these ELMS type options, and we say ELMS type options here because we don't know yet what the options are going to be, but we tried to think about what, make assumptions and educated guesses about what those options could look like. And we wanted to think about what ELMS type options in the upland farms, how those options might make up for the loss of the basic payment, which is going to occur as a result of the environmental land management scheme. But we'll talk a bit more about the policy background in another slide in a moment. So we took a number of approaches to trying to achieve those aims. The first stage was a policy review, where we looked at the policy drivers at play here and more details about the ELMS scheme. As Sarah mentioned, we worked with 3 case study farms in the Pendle area, and we were able to test out our approaches using those farms that then informed us to create this sort of generic Penn Farm case. Our approaches were specifically around natural capital assessment, and we'll talk about what natural capital is in a minute, creating what we thought might be ELMS type interventions and what an ELMS type future might look like for upland farms. And Joe specifically looked at assessing farm businesses both now in the baseline and what that might look like in an ELMS type future. So we're going to talk about the generic case today. Like Sarah said, it is land within the Pendle area, but it's a made up farm, but hopefully there'll be points that you can recognise in the generic case that might have similarities to your own farm setup. So first of all, what is natural capital? I'm sure you've heard it a lot. We're going to hear it a lot tonight if you haven't already. And it's important to understand what we mean by natural capital. And it's defined as the elements of nature that directly or indirectly produce value or benefits to people. So that includes whole ecosystems, the species within them, the fresh water, the different types of habitats like upland habitats or grassland habitats, the minerals, the air, the oceans, as well as natural processes and functions. And this natural capital is considered to be the stock of natural assets. For example, like I said, the habitat, soils and the water and the biodiversity. And it's this natural capital that produces what we call ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services provides benefits to people. And the diagram below just shows that there are 3 main categories of ecosystem services. There are the provisioning services like food production, so that might be meat or grain. There's timber production and water provision. The regulating services are obtained for, there are processes that basically regulate the environment, so like air quality regulation, climate regulation, pollination, water quality regulation, flood alleviation. And then there are the cultural benefits, for instance, recreational opportunities, the landscape that provides aesthetic experiences, landscape allowing people to go out and walk and run and cycle, which might in turn increase their health and mental well-being. We talk about intermediate services sometimes, but these are very much just the supporting functions that are essential to actually underpin some of these services. So they might be processes like nutrient cycling and soil formation and photosynthesis. So Joe's going to talk about the policy context.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. The policy context is Brexit and the withdrawal from membership of the European Union, and you'll be aware that we now have a deal, and some people regard it as thin or fat, depending what spectacles you're wearing, but it provides the context of an opportunity to reform agricultural policy as it has shaped agriculture over the last 50 years. Two particular pieces of legislation are central to this. The first is the Environment Bill, which is still going through the Parliament, and that includes a commitment, strong commitment for the protection of the natural environment and biodiversity, and that sets the broad context to this. And then there's the new Agricultural Act 2020 that was enacted in November last, and that takes elements of the commitments that will feature in the bill, the Environment Bill, to include payments for public goods, and this commitment to withdraw direct income support and introduce, as part of those measures, a new environmental land management scheme. And the government has just published its proposals for the transition to this new future. Now, with respect to elms, and there are a number of elements to the agriculture transition plan, elms is one of them, and you can see the themes on the right there. And these are themes that we will refer to in the presentation: a commitment to achieving beneficial change across issues of heritage, of clean air, climate change, clean water, protection from environmental hazards, and thriving plants and wildlife and biodiversity. So you'll see reference to those a number of times. So the next one, please. This is set in the context of a dependency generally in the agricultural sector, but particularly in the upland sector, a dependency on direct income support. And these two graphs show the degree of dependency, and you could say the degree of vulnerability to policy change. On the left, you see the contribution to farm business income by different sources for less favoured area grazing farms in England, averaged over the period shown, a period of about 5 years. And it shows the sources of farm business income. It's a measure of profitability of farms, but before direct charges for family labour. So it's an assessment, one assessment of profitability. But you can see the contribution from different sources: agriculture, agri-environment, diversification, and the BPS, the income support. So average incomes looking at the graph on the left, average incomes overall in total were about £24,000 per year. But you can see that the majority of that is dependent on BPS, farm income support. And actually a point to observe is that on average across the sector, agriculture actually makes a negative contribution. Overall, there are losses associated with agricultural production. So we'll come back to that point later on. If you look to the right, if you then look at farm business income with and without support, on the left, you have all sources of income. That's the £24,000 or so. And as you begin to deduct the farm income support, the BPS, and then on the right, you exclude BPS and agri-environment, you see that you're into negative average incomes. There's lots of variation within the sector. The top 25 performing farms are doing considerably better than the bottom 25%. So there's a lot of variation, but the picture essentially shows the dependency. And if you withdraw that BPS income support, then there is a clear vulnerability, and many businesses would not survive. So the question that we've got is, are there opportunities under the ELM scheme to plug that gap? So as Alison has said, we use 3 farm studies in the area to explore options, and then we've developed this indicative case, Penn Farm. So back to you, Alison, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So just to describe Penn Farm a bit, Penn Farm is a fairly typical upland farm, if there is one, in the Pendle Hill area. The farm runs downhill with rough grazing at the higher elevation, with improved pastures on the lower land towards the valley bottom, and we'll go into the kinds of habitats in the farm in a minute. The farm lies within the less favoured area designation, with sections in the disadvantaged and severely disadvantaged areas, with moorland at the top of the farm. It's 146 hectares in size, with 139 usable agricultural hectares, and is around 111 if you're using the adjusted agricultural terminology. It's mainly sheep with a small herd of beef cattle, and the stocking rate is about 0.85 units per hectare, and that's the adjusted rate. So this is a map of Penn Farm, and it basically shows the habitats and land covers on the farm. The farm starts up on the top, well, not quite on the top of the hill, but at the top of the hill on the southeast side, and runs downhill, so that the bottom, very thin part of the farm at the top left of your screen will be near enough the valley bottom. And so we have sort of rushy grassland and semi-natural rough grazing on the highest part of the farm. And the majority of the farm area, I think it's about 70% of the farm, is covered in improved grassland. There are some hedges, which you can see in green, and there are small areas of broadleaf woodland in the north of the farm. There are 2 streams running down, one in the north and one in the south. There's small areas of amenity grassland around the farm buildings, the bottom of the farm, and there's bracken and there's some bracken habitat running down the stream in the south from the top of the farm. So we're talking about, like I said, about 70% of improved grassland, 70% of the farm, 13% is semi-natural grassland, about 6% is semi-improved, and 1% is broadleaf woodland. So this next map shows that on Penn Farm, there are, the farm actually has some stewardship options in place. And the key at the bottom of the map shows these different options. And you probably know what these option codes are better than me, but just to remind us, there's some enclosed rough pasture with lenient grazing going on, which is the green speckledy fill. So that's on the hill. And then we've got permanent grassland with very low inputs on non-SDA area. So we've labelled the SDA, the severely disadvantaged area, on the east, and the DA area and the lower levels of the farm over to the west side. We've got very low input grassland on the SDA with cattle grazing and rush control. We've got management of rough grazing for birds and lenient grazing supplement, which is the GS17, and UP2, which is the orange area. We've got some temporary grassland under legume and herb rich sward down in the west, in the bottom corner of the farm, and we've got hedgerow management going on, maintenance of existing woodland, and payments for maintenance of traditional farm buildings. There's a few stewardship options going on there, and they do have implications for the kind of benefits that the farm can supply and also for biodiversity. So there's bound to be a little bit of an increase in biodiversity with some of those options in place. Joe?
Yep, so this is the current farming system. So it's essentially a sheep and beef farm. So that describes the size of the sheep flock, essentially 500 ewes and lambs, with some breeding lambs that's kept over as a replacement for replacements. And then also accompanied with rams. So you've got about 600 sheep on the farm and a small herd of suckler beef. Overall livestock units are about 97, and expressed then for against the land types, adjusting for the relative productivity of land, and the Farm Business Surveys expresses land in terms of its equivalent to a lowland or the best pasture on the farm. Then the adjusted area that you can see for the farm as a whole is 110 hectares, and then a contribution from moorland. So overall, there's an adjusted farm stocking rate of about 0.85 livestock units per hectare. And now you might want to bear that in mind, because some of the changes that we're considering involve reducing stocking numbers and reducing stocking rates in order to take up some of the environmental benefits. And that trade-off between agriculture, agricultural benefits and environmental benefits is important. So it's the next one?
Mm-hmm. Okay,
to you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so we've set the scene at Penn Farm, and I think thinking about this the options and the interventions, and thinking about elms, we really need to sort of get our head into this idea of benefits, natural capital assets and benefits, and the central to the idea of, well, the UK government's idea of this sort of sustainable farming is the idea that all farms are dependent on natural capital assets for food production. So the idea of protecting them is about protecting the assets that farming is built on. So important services for production of food are local climate regulation and erosion control, pest and disease control, soil quality regulation, and water flow regulation. But whilst farming is dependent on those assets, it also has impacts on natural capital and therefore the flow of those benefits. So it can increase those benefits or it can decrease those benefits. And some of the impacts are through, for instance, high livestock densities can cause some compaction and erosion, which in turn can impact on water flow and quality, but also decrease soil quality in some instances, although again, there's a fine balance. Some of the activities can cause some GHG emissions, and having, for instance, a very big area of sort of short improved grassland with compaction from livestock can cause increased localised flooding, and obviously choosing to farm and to have those kinds of habitats like improved grassland within the landscape means that there will be less biodiversity than there would if there were semi-natural habitats covering the area. So it's worth just thinking about how farming is dependent on assets, natural capital assets, but also can impact on them. So the next step is to think about the kinds of benefits that Penn Farm can provide. So here are those categories from that diagram about natural capital assets and ecosystem services. So we have the provisioning, the regulating and the cultural services. So on this farm, we consider these ecosystem services to be being provided at various levels. So crop and livestock production, or particularly livestock production here, fibre and fuel production and water, carbon sequestration, local climate regulation through the water quality and flow regulation, pollination, soil quality regulation, and also cultural services are very important on this farm. The actual farmed landscape and the landscape around Pendle Hill provides lots of beautiful views and aesthetic experiences for people. It's a source of education and training and culture, especially farming culture. It creates opportunities for recreation and tourism. There's lots of walking in the area, walking routes and footpaths. And obviously the biodiversity is valued by many people as well. So these are the kind of services that are provided by Penn Farm. And our first step was trying to get a handle on the level of provision of these services. And we did that in a number of ways. The first way was to just give a qualitative scoring to these different services. For instance, provisioning services, we can see that the food production service is very much enhanced because it's a farm, surprise, surprise. And so the other fibre and fuel and water services were considered to be lower provision. There's a sort of intermediate to low provision along the regulating service, just because of the kinds of land covers there are across the farm. So there's not much in the way of woodland and woody vegetation, which is good for storing carbon and sequestering carbon. And also they are good at local climate regulation and air quality regulation as well. Some of these other services like water quality regulation and flow are slightly maybe compromised by shorter vegetation and maybe some compaction as well. And obviously habitat and population maintenance is provided, but it's not high. I should have said actually that a score of 3 is very high provision, 0.5 provision is some provision, 1 is provision, and 2 is significant provision. But the farm does much better in terms of cultural services, where there's a significant provision across all of those services, for some of the reasons that I've already just alluded to in the previous slide. So provisioning service does very well there. Regulating services aren't doing too well, just due to the way that the land is managed at present, and cultural services are doing quite well. So the next step was to get a more quantitative handle on those ecosystem services or benefits. And we did that in 2 ways, which I shall present to you in a minute. First of all, we used a mapping approach to spatially map how the services are provided across Penn Farm. And then we also used what's called a natural capital accounting type approach, which while the mapping is an indicative approach and gives a score, it's not a qualitative approach, but it's a scoring approach based on actual models of biological processes. The natural capital account can actually calculate, for instance, tonnes of carbon sequestered and tonnes of pollution regulated by the habitats within the farm. Using that natural capital accounting approach, we could also look at the kinds of emissions that might come from agricultural practices, but also the peat soil habitats on the farm. So first, to show you a couple of maps from the mapping approach. I'm not going to show you all the maps, I'm just going to show you a couple, just so that you get the idea for the kinds of results that led on to us understanding a bit more about what kind of elms interventions might be appropriate on the farm. So first of all, this is actually a map of a carbon stock, of an ecosystem service. Well, it's not really an ecosystem, it's more of a natural capital stock. This is carbon storage. So our mapping approach maps each pixel within the map, and it gives it a score of between 1 and 100. A low score is a low score, or a 0 score would be in blue, and as it gets higher it goes through blue to green to yellow, and a high score of 100 is red. And so you will see a range of those colours through the maps. So this shows for carbon storage. So the areas of red are high provision of that service, and they tend to be where there are trees in the landscape. And a sort of medium provision of the service, the yellow colour, which is mostly over the improved grassland, shows that there's some carbon stored within the soil and the vegetation, but it's at a much lower level than you would expect from the trees and the woodland. And there's a slightly higher level of carbon storage in the sort of just above into the SDA area, which is like a moorland or heathlandy type habitat, or rough grass. I think it's actually semi-improved grassland, isn't it? But yeah, in that area it's slightly higher as well. So poster's decided to fall off the wall behind me just as I've said that. So this map shows the range of values for carbon storage across the farm, and really any sort of low provision of the service on the maps offers up opportunities where we think about changing the land cover into something that can be better, can perform better at sequestering carbon and then storing it. The next map is water flow, which can be thought of as a flood alleviation service. Again, we're looking at the low provision of flood alleviation service where there's blue, and then high provision of that service areas that are red. And this particular model is looking at the soil type and also the vegetation or habitat type and whether or not it's on a slope, and comes up with an indicator across all of those factors. And so what you find is the areas in red that are a high provision of the flood alleviation service are soaking up our soils and land covers that are able to break up and soak up water so that there's less runoff coming off the land in those areas. So you can see there are a few areas of the farm which are this sort of reddy brown colours that must have soils and land covers that are able to allow water to soak through and not run off. But large areas of the farm are the sort of medium provision of this service, and there are some low areas which are the sort of grey, bluey areas. So there are areas where there may be opportunities to think about different land covers that might be able to soak up water better. So something moving away from the sort of short improved grass might help in that respect. So these are the kinds of things we were considering when we were looking at the baseline natural capital assets and also the ecosystem service provision to think about what kinds of interventions might increase the public benefits from this farm. And looking at the baseline natural capital account, we measured the carbon sequestration of trees from trees and hedges, and also from increasing the grassland quality, which is through the stewardship option. And also looked at air quality regulation, timber production and agricultural production from Joe's analysis, but also at the GHG emissions. And really it's difficult to say anything about the numbers in isolation. It's better when you've got another scenario to compare it to, which we will later. But carbon sequestration is can be seen to be quite low, given that there's the number of trees and the area of trees and hedges on the farm is quite low. Certainly having an increased quality of grass sward helps sequester some more carbon compared to improved grassland. Air quality regulation really depends on trees and hedges, and again, because there are not many within the farm, that is also low, as is timber production. Agricultural production is measured in the livestock units, which, as Joe showed us, was 97 livestock units. And the GHG emissions from agriculture are, it's difficult to say whether they're high or not. They are what they are, but there are emissions from agricultural practices associated with this type of farming. And also we're including in this farm analysis an area of common land on the top of Pendle Hill, which is a blanket bog habitat, but is very dry and has been drained. So that will incur GHG emissions from that too. And so what we've done also is valued those. We've given them an annual monetary flow, annual monetary value, and we can see that there's a reasonable value associated with some of these ecosystem services. But obviously, when it comes to the GHG emissions from the common land and also from agriculture, that incurs a cost, if you like. It's a negative value. And overall, what we see is that the farm is a net emitter of carbon if you're comparing the GHG emissions to the amount of carbon that can be sequestered on the farm. Okay. Joe?
Okay. So again, the context of this is how do we plug the income gap that is left by the withdrawal of direct income support? And for an upland farmer to engage, as Mr. Gove encouraged us, to provide public goods in return for payments. An important element of all this, and as Alison is suggesting, is to be able to measure the existing conditions on the farm and the opportunities for providing public goods, and a basis for quantification. There's an important emphasis here on being able to measure it. And the other element of this is to be able to link this assessment of the provision of services with the reality of farm business management and accounting systems to demonstrate that the options that could be taken up would retain the viability of the business. So what we've done here is to link these two together and set these proposals in the context of farm business accounting conventions. On this slide, you see a summary at the top of the utilizable agricultural area and the adjusted agricultural areas that we referred to, and the stocking rates, and compares Penn Farm with an average LFA beef and sheep farm, and then looks at the key indicators of total output, of costs of farm business income, and so on, between Penn Farm and the average case. You can see total output from all sources, that's all income support, AES, agriculture and so on, is about £1,000 per hectare, and total costs around 790. And so the profit, the farm business income, the important thing before charging for family labour is about 190, £200 per hectare. But unpaid labour is quite substantial. And this would result in what's called a farm corporate income of a negative £100. So although the farm business is returning overall a profit in terms of farm business income, there hasn't yet been a formal charge for unpaid labour. And if you did the next slide, the next slide takes that and provides an overall picture of the contribution of to income from the various sources, from agriculture, ag environment, diversification and income support for this indicative farm case. You can see in the graphic towards the top there, from all sources, there is a positive farm business income of around £20,000. But if you deduct charges for unpaid family labour at average wage rates in the sector, then it becomes negative. And if you take away all the income support and ag environment schemes, then you get a significant negative costs, either with or without charging for unpaid labour. So there's a high dependency here on farm income support. So the challenge is, can we plug the gap with take up of environmental services under the ELMS programme? So the next one.
Okay, so we were using what we could understand about Penn Farm from the mapping and the natural capital accounting and understanding of its natural capital assets, which is something that farmers will have to do as part of a farm plan under ELMS, it seems. and trying to understand, therefore, what the opportunities were for increasing certain public benefits. And this table, it documents really on the left-hand column the kinds of interventions we thought would tick all the boxes in terms of the categories that DEFRA want elms interventions to address. So those were the ones that Joe talked about early in an earlier slide, and they're across the top. So it was clean drinking water, environmental hazards, increasing biodiversity, and I think there was carbon sequestration in there as well. And so this table shows the types of interventions that we thought would be good at Penn Farm. So we've suggested putting in blocks of woodland, providing woody shelter belts, which are really double hedges with trees in the middle. We've thought about riparian woodland and grassland buffers with scrub, and also the addition of ponds and swales in terms of natural flood management and woody debris dams. We've increased grassland quality. We've restored some hedges and created some new ones. We've thought about restoring the heather and dry heath at the top of the farm and restoring the blanket bog on the common land. There's interventions involving bracken removal, semi-natural grass and restoration and scrub management, management of rough grazing for birds, fencing watercourses to keep livestock out to increase water quality, maintenance of traditional farm buildings, stone walls, improving public access and increasing educational visits. So a wide range of interventions we're putting into place in Penn Farm. And those can bring benefits, ecosystem service benefits, which are listed there also in the table. And they tick many boxes in terms of carbon sequestration, water quality, flood alleviation, air pollution regulation, pollination, restoring habitats and increasing biodiversity, increasing cultural heritage, and also recreational opportunities. So these seem to be appropriate interventions for Penn Farm. And these are the options in pictorial form, effectively. They're showing spatially across the farm where we put these elms type interventions. And there's a significant area of wood pasture that we've created, which is the green with the brown spots. And we've also talked about, like I said, restoring the heather and the dry heath. We're creating woodland, a big block of woodland at the top of the farm, which also connects into other woody areas that surround the farm, which is good for biodiversity. We're talking about increasing the area of increased grassland quality. And yes, you can see that there's some, the squares for woody debris dams down the river to slow the flow of water, offline ponds to also capture water and wet some of the habitat up at the top of the catchment of the farm, and also the fences and walls and the shelter belts. So those were the types of interventions on the farm that we thought would have the most benefit. And in terms of natural capital assets, that does change the land covers on the farm. So we had 70% improved grassland initially, and under this elms options, we now only have 30% improved grassland. We've increased semi-natural grassland by 1%, and semi-improved grassland goes up 17%. Broadleaf woodland increases to 8% from 1%, so that's 11 hectares of woodland within there. And we've got this extra silver pastoral system, which is the sort of wood pasture, which is now 22% of the farm. So it's changed the natural capital assets significantly. And when we again start to assess the farm for ecosystem service provision under this new elm scenario, we can see there is a change in certainly some of the services from the baseline to elms. So we've got the baseline scores in there and the elm scores, and you can see that livestock production does go down because there is a reduction in the density of livestock that we've suggested for the farm. At the same time, there is an increase in timber and wood fuel production because there are more trees. many of the regulating services will increase because of this addition of more trees and better quality grassland and the restoration of these habitats, which allows carbon to be sequestered and stored and to regulate the climate better and to regulate air quality, water flow and water quality. And some of the cultural services will also increase due to the increased provision of access to footpaths and also to the increase in education and training on farm. So to take the quantitative assessment route here, we've got physical flows and annual monetary flows for the baseline, and then we've got the same for elms, and then I've got 2 columns at the end which show the difference between the baseline and the elms, so whether the benefits have increased or decreased as a result of what we've done. So we can see that carbon sequestration for trees and hedges has gone up significantly because there are more trees and hedges in the landscape. And that's an increase in an annual monetary flow of about £1,000 a year. Carbon sequestered by increasing the grassland quality from improved grassland to a more semi-natural type grassland has also increased carbon sequestration. And that's quite significant because there's a large area of grass within the farm. And that's the same story for air quality regulation, timber production, although agricultural production does go down slightly because obviously, as I said, the number of livestock has reduced on the farm. But it's significantly the GHG emissions from agriculture and from carbon emission from the peaked habitat has on the common land has also gone down. So GHG emissions have gone up, so the provision of the benefit is now more positive, if you like. And the balance, the carbon balance, means that the farm is now sequestering carbon. So it's a net sequesterer, if that's actually a word, rather than a net emitter. Joe?
Okay, yeah, thanks. Good. I mean, as Alison has suggested, the adoption of these ELMS options will involve a significant change in the intensity of land use and the number of animals carried on the farm. And there's an important trade-off between agricultural production and the provision of these ecosystem services or public goods. And a lot of the choice will depend on the kind of relationship between these two and the pivot between the production of livestock and the provision of these services. And it can be summarized in this chart where you've got the relationship between livestock units per hectare and gross margins. And on the bottom axis, there the intensity of grassland production. In the main, in the area, the most intensively farmed grassland, improved pastures, are receiving between 75 and 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And then there's a move through this under existing stewardship schemes on that diagram to the left in terms of reduced nitrogen, zero nitrogen species-rich pasture, and then into rough grazing and so on. And you can see the trade-off. What this will involve essentially in the adoption of the ELMS options is moving on the more intensive land on the right and in higher inputs of nitrogen in particular, and intensive grazing systems to move to the left. And that involves a trade-off essentially between agricultural output and environmental provision. You can see in its perhaps most intensive form, the gross margins, that's output less the direct costs of fertilizers and feeds for livestock, are about £300 per hectare, going down to about £150 per hectare for the less intensive systems. And we based that on empirical evidence from site observations elsewhere, and also speaking to our 3 farmers and some modelling approaches. Next one, please. Okay, so what we did was we looked at the various options that Alison has suggested, and looked at the implications for, first of all, changes in income from stewardship, from the agricultural environmental schemes, the existing stewardship arrangements, and then and the extent to which revenue from agricultural environment schemes could increase under ELMS compared to the existing situation under stewardship, and then also the implication of the loss of income support. So this is summarized here. And now these figures are suggestions, and it's important to preface remarks here by saying these are indicative for a case study farm. There's a lot of variation in practice across the landscape, and if you don't like, these are some suggestions, and if you don't like these, we would have others, but they're indicative of the situation. So you can see in the top row in this slide, the new ELMS options give revenue of about £33,000, but there are some significant costs here. And so there's a net return there of about £23. If you prefer to look at them on a per hectare basis, then you can see revenues at £384 costs and a net return of about £216 per hectare, compared to the current AES arrangements of around 54, you can see. So the change in the AES, the Agricultural Environment Scheme income under ELMS, we're suggesting would be about, you can see going across that green shaded row, £162 per hectare, because there are costs involved in delivering these options. The BPS loss, the next row, involves a loss, if you prefer it on a hectare basis, £211 loss. The bottom line is perhaps the most important one. What's the difference between the extra that you get under ELMS, net of the current stewardship income, less the income support? And if you go across that line, you can see at a farm level, there's a negative of about 5,400, and on a per hectare basis, about £50 per hectare. So it's not fully covering the gap at the moment. Now that's on the basis of income from stewardship, but we've still got to look at the impact on agricultural income as a result of these adoptions of these ELMS options, because as we've said, we will be reducing our livestock numbers of the order of 22%. So that in terms of sheep would mean reducing sheep numbers by about, what's that, 120, 130, 140 sheep if you targeted the flock. So a reduction of about 22% of stocking rates. So the next one, please. In terms of the options that are taken up, the revenue and capital spend involved in these, you can see, we would be generating, it's suggested from ELMS, from the income from ELMS, of about £239 per hectare per year. And you can see where it's coming from, mainly from wood pasture, some field management, particularly adoption of species-rich pasture and so on, water management, and then cultural services around reinstatement of pathways and traditional walls, stone walls, and so on. The capital costs can be quite significant, based on our estimates of £148 per hectare, but a significant amount of capital grant, but a farmer contribution of around £29, £30 per hectare. And then there would be some minor capital works that would be covered by the annual payments. So that's the kind of breakdown in terms of revenue generation within the ELMS options. So woodlands and wood pasture that we've identified as an important opportunity are a significant contributory source of income here. We can come back to that and the implications of moving towards a woodland pasture option for this. Okay, next one, please. Now, it gets a bit more complicated because we've got not only we've got the extra income from elms, less the loss of the income support, but we've also got the impact on agriculture. And as a result of our options, we're reducing stock numbers by about 22%, we said, going to a less intensive system. And if you can see in this chart that halfway down, we show the change in agricultural net income associated with reduced stock numbers. And we get a change in the agricultural gross margins from our sheep in particular, a small reduction in the beef herd. But then we can achieve significant savings in fixed costs, but it does require a scrutiny of the way that we're managing fixed costs on the farm. And we've made some assumptions about what is possible there. And we've focused on savings in labour and machinery in particular. Now remember that we'll be saving some labour costs associated with agricultural production, but also our elm options are going to be generating a need for employment. And so labour begins to switch from agriculture into the provision of environmental services. But a key issue here depends on the assumptions around the profitability of agriculture and livestock production in the first place. And we made an observation earlier that actually in this example, the returns from livestock production under the existing situation are negative. So agriculture is not covering all of its costs. So on the face of it, you might assume that actually cutting back agricultural production could be beneficial financially. And that can be the case if you can obviously save the direct costs of producing beef and sheep, but a key issue becomes particularly how you manage fixed costs and manage to reduce labour costs and power and machinery and general overheads and so on. And there's also an argument which you'll be familiar with, promoted by Colin Clark, and the discussion around more for less. If there would seem to be opportunities for reducing the direct costs of livestock production associated with expenditure on feed and fertilizer, and increasing the use and dependency on grass-based diets as a way of increasing the margins on livestock. So there are some opportunities there. We thought it would be perhaps a bit dangerous at this stage to assume automatic savings from those kinds of changes. Those are changes that could be done at the moment, actually, not necessarily associated with the adoption of elms, but there's clearly scope here for improving the efficiency of agricultural production and livestock production in these systems. But we thought it reasonable to assume savings in fixed costs here of around 7%. The biggest fixed costs on the farm, of course, are labour. And there may be some opportunities under tenanted systems for reduction in rents. But there you can see at the bottom of that the change in the total income that you get overall, having looked at changes in income from the current stewardship scheme and the elms, and also the changes in agricultural production that will be required, you get a change in net income here. There's still a gap of around £6,000 or around £61 per hectare. So we're not quite filling the gap. Now we could go back and have a look again and refine our estimates to see whether a more intensive uptake of the elms options would actually close that gap. But the important point here is that there has been a substantial reduction in the number of livestock carried on the farm. And you can see to the right there the kind of sensitivity of these estimates to changes. We could, if we had an increase, and it's important to say that our assumptions on payment rates for ELMS options here are based on the legacy payments for the stewardship arrangements, because the new payment rates have not been announced by DEFRA, so we don't know what payments will be made. But basing these on the stewardship scheme, an increase in payment rates of around 30% would plug the gap on this farm. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about the payment rates reflecting the benefits that are delivered rather than the cost incurred. And that's a point that perhaps we could come on to. But lots of variation in these estimates because of the uncertainty in the derivation of them, and considerable uncertainty into the future. So, and the next one.
Yeah, Joe, we're pretty much run out of time, so okay. We really need to finish up now.
Okay, I'll move on and just go to the next. We also looked at Agri forestry products, and an important opportunity here is for wood pasture and the integration of agroforestry with livestock production. Lots of interest in this at the moment, and there's some discussion over what the incentives might be for this into the future. We looked at that, and there are some opportunities for additional income of around possibly £70 per hectare per year on that. So next slide, Alison, quickly on this. And that, onto the conclusions, I think. Do you want me to speak on these, Alison, or do you want to do them?
Oh, I'm happy. So basically, to conclude, we found that ELMS type options can help to provide multiple public benefits, and we've showed that using our quantification of the natural capital assets and ecosystem services. So the natural capital approach does help reveal these benefits. But it could be improved to suit the farm scale application. So it would be good if it could support some decisions like what if type assessments of options. It's going to be useful and probably have to be modified slightly for farm plans. So that will include maps and assessments of ELMS opportunities and looking at local priorities, feasibility, and perhaps even collaboration among farmers in the area. The assessments have implications for farm businesses and finance, and also this kind of assessment approach could be used for looking into monitoring of ELMS adoption as well. So the question we asked at the beginning was, will ELMS close the gap left from the loss of BPS? Well, yes-ish, but it does depend on the context of farm businesses, like Joe was talking about earlier. So there are a number of things that have arisen from this, and there are a lot of questions still to be answered and understanding to come around what the impacts of ELMS are going to be in terms of sustainable farming. Will it deliver that, and will it deliver nature recovery? We don't know what will come out of forcing the efficiency in farming. Will it add value and reduce costs? Do you get more for less? We don't know about ELMS payments, what type of compensation schemes they will be running, whether they'll cover capital costs. There may be issues around whether you own your farm or you're a tenant, and whether the landlord will be the person that the payments go to, or the tenant. There may be new markets and incentives coming on in terms of water and carbon and biodiversity offsetting. These are certainly starting now. And there's definitely scope for multi-farm collaborations along looking at nature recovery networks and landscape recovery in general. And there's certainly a need for guidance, advice and support in delivering ELMS on the ground.
It's probably worth just emphasising, Alison, that there is specific reference to natural capital accounting in the transition plan with respect to elms. So this kind of approach and quantification is being recommended as part of farm plans.
Well, it's absolutely necessary if it's payment for results as well. Okay, so we've taken up quite a lot of time. I'm really sorry it's overrun a little bit. Have we got time for discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you, Joe. There's so much in it. I know I gave you quite a tall order to run through so many months of work in 45 minutes. So I was just wanted to open up the floor. I'll pause the record.